Hey guys, tonight we step into the twilight of medieval Greece, where the salt air of the Aegean mingles with whispers of bells no one has ever proven to exist. Imagine the island of Rhodes, a fortress of stone rising against blue waters, its harbours crowded with galleys, its streets echoing with languages from across the Mediterranean. Yet beneath the clang of swords and the chants of monks, people claim to hear something stranger, bells ringing where no tower stands, tolling in hours of need, tolling perhaps from the depths of memory itself. You can picture yourself standing on the ramparts, straining your ears, only to wonder whether hunger, fear or faith is shaping the sound. And let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes inside a medieval siege here between the dysentery, the arrows and the complete absence of Wi-Fi. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, share your location and local time down in the comments. I love seeing our little global circle of night owls and early risers connecting across centuries. Now find yourself a cozy seat or a soft bed, let your mind begin to unwind, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The island of Rhodes in the late Middle Ages is more than just a dot on the map. It is a crossroads, a jewel contested by empires, and above all the home of the Knights Hospitaller. These were warrior monks technically sworn to poverty, but somehow still managing to build fortresses thicker than your average tax manual. Their order had shifted here after being ousted from the Holy Land, and by the early 15th century they were dug in deep, their walls bristling with cannons, their harbours bustling with trade. Rhodes became both a shield against Ottoman expansion and a marketplace where Venetians, Genoese and Levantine traders all rubbed shoulders. Mainstream historical fact affirms this. Rhodes under the Hospitallers was a formidable military stronghold, its fortifications among the most advanced in Europe. These defences included concentric walls, massive bastions and deep moats, designed not only to withstand sieges, but also to announce to every visitor that this was a place built to endure. Yet amid these stone certainties grew tales far less tangible, the phantom bells. The first whispers drift into chronicles like stray threads. A merchant from Venice, waiting out a storm, notes in his diary that he heard bells ringing in the night, though the churches were shuttered. A monk passing through repeats a rumour that during the siege of 1444, bells tolled within the city, though the belfries were silent. To the people of Rhodes, especially during sieges when every sound carried like prophecy, these phantom chimes became omens. Some said they warned of danger, others swore they promised deliverance. Here's the quirky tidbit that sticks. One legend insists the bells were not forged of bronze at all, but were relics left from the Colossus of Rhodes, the giant statue toppled centuries before. Supposedly fragments of its bronze had been melted into ghostly bells hidden away and cursed never to be seen. If you think that sounds like an early marketing ploy for haunted artifacts, you're not alone. Yet such a detail would explain why the bells were said to sound not from towers, but from beneath the earth, a subterranean chorus reminding people that the island's past was never fully buried. The deeper tension, though, lies in what these stories meant to those who heard them. Picture villagers pressed close in candlelit chapels, hearing tolls that no sexton had rung. Imagine soldiers on midnight watch, nerves already stretched, swearing. They heard bells echo across the waves. Bells were the heartbeat of medieval life, marking time, calling people to prayer, warning of fire or invasion. To hear them when no rope had been pulled was unsettling, like hearing your phone buzz when it's not even in the room. Historians still argue whether these tales of phantom bells were exaggerations layered on after the fact, or whether they record genuine experiences of sound distorted by wind, sea and stone. Anyone who has lived near cliffs knows how waves can make groaning noises that mimic human cries. Anyone who has wandered through narrow streets knows how echoes can turn a single sound into a chorus. Yet for the medieval mind, such phenomena were not just quirks of acoustics, they were messages. Bells that should not exist but did in the ears of many carried meaning. The story glides forward with this paradox. Rhodes thrives as a fortress, yet the memory of the phantom bells creeps alongside every battle, every festival, every moment of tension. People argue whether they are divine signs, pagan remnants, or tricks of the Turks meant to unsettle the defenders. The bells toll at the edge of certainty where faith, fear and imagination blur. And if you've ever mistaken the hum of your fridge for a voice at night, you understand a sliver of their unease. Already by the 15th century, the phantom bells of Rhodes had become more than rumour, they were folded into the identity of the place. Pilgrims carried the tale back to Europe, seafarers retold it in taverns, and scribes copied it into margins. The bells had no weight, no metal, no tower, and yet they were real enough to survive in words, and words as history shows us often last longer than stone. The city of Rhodes has always known how to balance spectacle and secrecy. In the Middle Ages, the narrow streets twist like threads in a loom, each alley clattering with donkey hooves, each courtyard alive with the smell of fish salted in barrels or bread cooling on stone shelves. At first glance, it seems like any Mediterranean port, busy, noisy, ordinary. But the ordinary in Rhodes always hides a little shadow. Tonight that shadow lingers not in the markets or the taverns, but high above in the rumour of bells that toll without towers, as if the air itself remembers a sound no one has struck. The medieval city was no backwater. Historians note that by the 14th century, Rhodes had become a stronghold of the Knights Hospitaller, a fortress city bristling with walls, bastions, and a harbour that saw everything from Venetian galleys to Ottoman scouts. It was in other words exactly the kind of place where sound mattered. Bells usually marked hours, warned of fire, or summoned fighters to the ramparts. When a bell rang in Rhodes, you knew why. Except, of course, when you didn't. And that is where our phantom story begins to shimmer. Travellers whispered of bells at midnight when none were scheduled. Pilgrims claimed they heard tones deep underwater, as though a cathedral had sunk into the harbour. A merchant once swore his ship creaked in rhythm with invisible chimes. As he docked at dawn, a serenade no other sailor noticed. These stories are not carved in marble inscriptions, but they cling to the edges of documents like mould in the margins. Historians still argue whether these accounts were deliberate metaphors, mistranslations, or genuine descriptions of something uncanny. Imagine yourself standing on the wall near the Agios Athanasios gate, watching the waves slap against stone. The torches flicker, the night is heavy with salt. Suddenly a sound rolls across the wind bronze solemn, neither near nor far. A sentry laughs nervously and says, "Must be the wine." Another spits and mutters that no wine he knows can forge a note so heavy. You lean forward, hoping to glimpse the tower, but there is none. Just the harbour, the sky, and the suspicion that something vast is being struck beyond sight. A quirky tidbit pops up in local lore. Some said the bells belonged to the drowned Colossus of Rhodes, that giant bronze statue toppled centuries earlier. According to the tale, pieces of the Colossus were scattered into the sea, and when the waves hit the hollow bronze, the fragments groaned like bells. It's nonsense. Of course, the pieces had long been carted off by traders, but the image is irresistible. Picture fishermen straining nets while the seafloor hums with phantom resonance, Poseidon himself playing percussion with relics of the past. If nothing else, it makes for a story you'd want to tell over wine, even if it cost you your sleep. Daily life in Rhodes wrapped itself in such half-beliefs. Children were warned not to wander after dark, lest the bells call them into the waves. Monks claimed the phantom tolls were omens, messages from saints, locked in endless debate behind unseen doors. One night, ever the practical fellow joked that the bells were just stubborn goats clanging against metal buckets in the alleys. His companions laughed, but less than half-heartedly. Humour is easier when the night is not so loud. Of course, bells had real functions in Rhodes. The Order of the Knights maintained strict schedules, prayers at dawn, and dusk alarms for pirate raids and signals for fires. Records describe these routines with military precision, leaving little room for stray noises. That precision makes the phantom accounts more unsettling. If bells rang outside the schedule, then something or someone had slipped control. Medieval societies thrived on order, and the very idea of a bell without a ringer was in itself a small rebellion against certainty. By the 15th century, travellers from Italy, Byzantium, and even far-off England noted the strangeness. A Venetian pilgrim wrote of a sound at night which no tower marks and no man admits. A Byzantine chronicler suggested it was the echo of bells, once belonging to churches destroyed during the earlier earthquakes that plagued the island. He claimed the earth itself had memorised the tones, and released them occasionally like a sigh. Historians still argue whether he meant that literally or poetically. Either way, the metaphor catches Rhodes as a body at stones and waters capable of remembering its memory tolling in bronze chords. Picture again the streets at midnight. An old woman pours water into a clay jug and pauses, cocking her head. The jug slips in her hands as she hears the toll. Across town, a knight at prayer presses his fingers tighter around his rosary. A fisherman, sleepless by the docks, raises his head and whispers a curse. None of them know if they are the only one listening or if everyone hears and pretends not to. Silence after the toll feels heavier than the sound itself. Another quirky note: some Rhodes folk believed the phantom bells marked deaths before they happened. A man would hear a toll, and by morning word would spread that a neighbour had passed in the night. The correlation may have been coincidence, but People are good at linking events when fear is involved. The bells became prophets, their notes weighted with foreboding. People joked about it nervously. Better hope you don't hear a duet tonight. 3 laughs, maybe 4, and then the silence presses back. So where did these sounds come from? Scholars have offered theories, of course. Some suggest seismic activity in the region. The Dodecanese Islands sit on restless geological seams, could create booming or ringing noises amplified across stone walls and water. Others propose wind striking particular hollow chambers in the old fortifications, turning the walls into accidental instruments. These are plausible, but they don't quite explain why the stories insist on the sound of bells specifically. Bells, after all, are not just sounds, but symbols they call, they warn, they sanctify. A boom in the earth can rattle you, but a bell commands you. And so the phantom bells slip into that hazy middle space between fact and legend, anchored by enough mentions to resist dismissal, yet vague enough to remain unsolved. They cling to Rhodes like salt in the air. Every traveller tastes them, but no one can pin them down. They toll not in towers, but in memory, not to announce an hour, but to remind people that some hours have no measure. And every time they sound in the stories, Rhodes itself becomes not just a fortress, but a riddle. Life along the waterfront of Rhodes does not quiet easily, even under the long shadow of siege. The harbour, normally loud with sailors' shouts and the slap of ropes on wood, grows subdued. Yet the city still listens to the water as though it might carry news. The sea breeze lifts scraps of sound, seagulls shrieking, rigging creaking, and sometimes late at night something stranger. A faint peal drifts across the waves, not the clang of anchor chains or the creak of a mast, but a bell's clear strike. Citizens pause mid-step, fishmongers halt with half-gutted catch in hand, and children crane their necks toward the dark horizon. The sound does not come from the city's churches or monasteries. Those bells remain silent in the grip of curfews. It comes instead from the sea itself, or so they insist. And the confusion builds because bells do not float, and yet the echo seems to ride the waves as surely as foam. The strangeness is sharpened by the fact that Rhodes does indeed have a long tradition of bells. Mainstream history confirms that by the medieval period, bells were widely used in Orthodox churches across the Byzantine world, calling congregants to liturgy, marking time or signalling danger. These bells were forged of bronze, some adorned with Greek inscriptions invoking saints or fragments of scripture. Their tones were distinctive, deep metallic voices that could travel far over stone and water. To the citizens of Rhodes, the sound of a bell was as familiar as the crow of a rooster, which is why when they heard one tolling from beyond the walls in the middle of the night, they knew instantly that something was wrong. Familiarity is what makes the uncanny truly bite. Quirky tidbits slip into local lore as they often do. Some sailors whispered that the phantom bells came from a sunken monastery, drowned long ago when part of the coastline collapsed in an earthquake. The Aegean, after all, is restless ground. Entire towns had been known to vanish beneath its waves, their stones shaken loose by tremors. It is not hard to imagine bronze bells sinking with them, their voices supposedly released whenever the seabed shifted. Others claim the sounds came from pirate ships hovering in the dark, dragging great iron gongs behind them to terrify Rhodes into surrender. This theory makes less sense, but it spreads anyway, because people under siege clutch at any explanation, even one involving theatrical pirates. The waterfront is also where anxiety sharpens most quickly. Merchants once traded amphorae of oil and crates of figs here, but during siege their warehouses hold only shadows. Families walk the piers at dusk, staring into the waves, listening for sounds that may or may not be real. Children toss pebbles into the water and declare that each ripple is an answer from Neptune. A mother hushes her son, telling him not to speak the god's name too loudly, because the sea already sounds restless enough. Skepticism and belief wrestle in the salt air. Historians still argue whether the bells were ever truly heard, or whether they were a product of the mind under pressure. Siege does not only starve the body, it starves the senses, making people hear footsteps where there are none, see shadows swell into soldiers. Some later accounts dismiss the bells as mass hallucination, a trick of waves echoing against stone walls. Yet others argue the reports are too consistent, too widespread to be mere invention. Chroniclers describe sailors, monks, soldiers, and even foreign mercenaries all reporting the same phantom tolling. Such variety of witnesses is harder to brush aside. At night the strangeness deepens. Torches along the piers sputter in the sea wind and watchmen pace the battlements. Beyond the surf, the enemy camps flicker with their own fires, a horizon of menace. When the bells sound again, their tones roll faintly above the distant drums and shouts. Defenders grip their spears tighter, glancing toward one another with eyes that ask questions no one wants to voice. Is it an omen, a warning, or a trick meant to sap their morale? One weary soldier mutters that if the bells keep ringing, at least they save the effort of staying awake, half a joke, half an admission that no one sleeps soundly in Rhodes these days. The sound carries into the taverns where defenders try to forget hunger with watered wine. Men lean over rough-hewn tables, their helmets stacked at their feet, and swap stories about what they have heard. One swears the bells ring in threes, another insists it is always 7. A monk corrects them, saying he counted exactly 12 tolls, a holy number, perhaps even protective. The debate is less about accuracy and more about control. If they can measure the mystery, perhaps they can manage it. A drunk soldier raises his cup and declares that if the bells belong to the sea, then the sea must pay its taxes like everyone else. Laughter follows ragged but welcome a brief rebellion against the uncanny. Meanwhile, the city's leaders try to craft explanations. Some argue the bells are signals between enemy ships, some secret code meant to coordinate attacks. Scouts sent to watch the harbours return empty-handed, reporting no vessels, no movements, only empty water. Others suggest the bells might come from deep wells within the city, their echoes distorted and carried by underground channels until they surface near the harbour. This explanation is tidy, almost comforting, until someone points out that no one has actually struck those bells in weeks. The debate circles endlessly, each theory colliding with another, none fully satisfying. And so the bells keep tolling erratic yet insistent, like the heartbeat of a city caught between faith and fear. Every new night brings the possibility of their return. Sometimes they are louder booming across the bay, sometimes they are faint like whispers caught in seashells. Always they come when least expected, refusing to obey any schedule. People begin to orient their days around them, half joking that the phantom bells are more reliable than the magistrate's decrees. But beneath the humour lies unease, because the bells speak without lips, and no one can say who listens on the other side of their sound. The waterfront becomes a theatre of listening. Fishermen tie up their empty nets and crouch by the docks, ears cocked like hounds. Priests sprinkle holy water into the surf, making the sign of the cross as if to sanctify the sea. Soldiers lean on their spears and hum tunelessly, trying to drown out what they fear to hear, and through it all the waves lap steadily, indifferent to human dread. The bells are not constant, but the waiting for them is a silence that tightens like a belt. The city of Rhodes does not exist in a vacuum, even in the shadow of strange bells. Beyond its thick walls lies a wider medieval world, where power shifts like sand in the wind. Traders from Venice and Genoa dock in its harbours, their ships groaning with barrels of wine, amphorae of oil, and bales of saffron-dyed cloth. Crusaders still clinging to the dream of holy wars pass through the island on their way to the east, muttering prayers and polishing swords that are far more decorative than practical. The Byzantine Empire itself, already fraying at the edges, tries to assert some measure of authority, though everyone knows its grip on the Aegean is weaker than the grip of barnacles on the hull of a fishing boat. Rhodes sits at the crossroads, both literally and symbolically a hinge between worlds, and that makes its mysteries resonate more deeply. A mainstream historical fact anchors the scene. Rhodes was indeed one of the most important maritime stations in the medieval Mediterranean, its position granting it wealth and exposure to countless influences. Ports bustled, not just with goods, but with news rumours and the occasional exaggerations spun into legend by the time it reached inland markets. This is the soil from which stories of phantom bells could grow fertile ground, where superstition, seafaring myth and religious anxiety entwine like ivy creeping up the stones of the harbour fortifications. Inside the city, daily life continues, though it bends under the weight of uncertainty. Bakers haul coarse loaves from smoky ovens, their flour stretched thin with ground beans. Women in saffron stolas carry wicker baskets heavy with olives or figs, pausing to gossip about the sounds some swear they heard last night. Muffled tolls drifting across the midnight air. Priests in indigo robes shuffle between altars, fumbling incense over iron fire tongs, as though smoke could shield the faithful from dread. Children dart between marble columns, laughing nervously about how they will climb the bell tower one day, and silence the ghost with their own hands. Even laughter sounds thinner now, an echo pretending to be cheer. Meanwhile, sailors in russet tunics sit on overturned amphorae at the quay, sharing tales that sharpen unease into entertainment. One insists he heard the bells only once, and that they sounded not like bronze at all, but like the groan of a ship's mast under storm. Another swears the sound came when no wind stirred too clean, too measured to be chance. They trade theories between gulps of watered wine that a hidden cult rings them in secret, that drowned monks told them from beneath the sea, or that angels sound warnings before the island itself collapses. Each tale earns nods, chuckles, or shivers, depending on the listener's mood and how much wine they've had. Quirky stories sprout like wildflowers. A fisherman claims his donkey froze mid-step when the bells rang, as though even beasts understood something uncanny had passed. A child swears her doll whispered hush at the same instant the tolls echoed through the dark. A monk more earnest than others insists that the bells align with lunar cycles, ringing faintly at the moment when shadows of the earth brush across the moon. Whether anyone believes him is another matter, but the claim is repeated often enough that farmers start glancing nervously at the sky whenever the moon grows fat. Historians still argue whether these stories represent genuine collective memory, or the exaggerated embroidery of later chroniclers. Were the bells truly heard by many, or were they always the invention of a few anxious scribes eager to add drama to otherwise ordinary records? Some suggest that the phantom tolling was a metaphor, a way of describing political decline or economic hardship in terms people could grasp. Others insist that the persistence of the legend across centuries hints at something more concrete, something real that rattled through stone and psyche alike. The lack of certainty is what makes the debate endure long after the voices themselves fell silent. At the heart of it all stands the bell tower itself, or rather what is left of it. The structure looms tall, shadowing the forum with its unmoving silhouette. Cracks climb its sides like veins, pigeons roost in niches where saint statues once stood, and moss creeps upward despite the salt air. From its summit one can see the sprawl of the harbour, the curve of the coastline, and on clear days the shimmer of distant Anatolia. Yet what the eye cannot see is what unsettles most the sound. No one can locate the tolls that ring without hands to strike them. The tower becomes less a building than a stage for uncertainty, its stones a mute chorus backing the drama of imagination. At night the tension thickens. Torches flicker along walls, casting long indigo shadows. Merchants lock shutters and mutter prayers while cats prowl alleys, as if patrolling secrets only they can sense. Somewhere in the distance the faint clang of iron echoes, maybe a hammer in a forge, maybe a ship's chain rattling, and hearts leap certain the bells are at it again. Mothers hush children with stories that it is only the gods practicing their music. Fathers shake heads, reminding them that gods rarely play tunes so mournful. And so, the legend lives another night, feeding itself on whispers, doubts, and the way silence becomes unbearable unless broken by something extraordinary. The phantom bells of Rhodes are not only a sound, but a lens. Through them, people glimpse fears of invasion, hunger, or divine punishment. Through them, scholars glimpse the fragile seam between myth and history. And through them we glimpse how a community clings to narrative when explanations slip away. The bells may be phantom, but the echoes they leave behind are real, etched in manuscripts, in architecture, and in the restless imaginations of those who walked beneath their toll. The midpoint of the siege feels like the midpoint of a very long and comfortable dinner party, where no one is enjoying the food, no one can leave the table, and everyone suspects the host might poison the wine just to keep things interesting. The defenders of Rhodes are caught in that strange twilight of endurance, too stubborn to surrender, too weary to fight, and too uncertain of what tomorrow might bring. The bells, of course, still toll in their imagination, whether or not iron ever struck bronze in the night air. By this stage, the bells have become a symbol that walks beside hunger, beside smoke, beside the creak of leather armour, and each citizen holds a private theory about them. Some say they are divine encouragement, others whisper that they are a warning, a few insist they never hear them at all, only smile tolerantly, while neighbours argue about tones and patterns, as if debating which bard plays the better tune. In a city fraying at the edges, even disagreement becomes precious a reminder that voices still exist, that speech has not yet drowned in despair. The phantom bells, real or not, now serve as the city's favourite pastime. They argue over them the way people later argue about who makes the best baklava, fiercely, endlessly, but with more passion than food at hand. The broader reality is less amusing. Mainstream history confirms that by the late medieval period the Knights Hospitaller had turned Rhodes into one of the Mediterranean's most fortified cities. Ramparts layered upon ramparts, moats, wide enough to swallow siege towers and artillery platforms, bristling like porcupine quills, made the place a nightmare for any besieger. Yet those walls, however mighty, could not conjure food from thin air. Grain shipments faltered, cisterns dropped inch by inch, and merchants who once filled markets with spices and figs had long since disappeared. Siege warfare is less about flashy battles and more about slow arithmetic. Every loaf subtracted, every barrel drained, every stomach counting the days. One quirky story, passed down in a half-jesting chronicle, tells of a baker who managed to keep selling bread long after flour ran out. His secret allegedly was grinding olive pits and mixing them with water until they formed a hard greyish dough that could be chewed if not exactly enjoyed. Children nicknamed it stone bread, and the joke caught on so thoroughly that soldiers teased each other, "Eat one more slice and your teeth will join the rubble." No historian can prove the recipe existed, though anyone who has ever faced a poorly cooked flatbread knows it is plausible. The real point is that humour persisted. People could laugh at teeth-shattering bread even while hunger gnawed at them, and that laughter became its own kind of nourishment. Historians still argue whether the bells were part of that humour, a collective joke shared among citizens to lighten the weight of nights that otherwise pressed too heavily. Did someone ring a hidden chime at intervals just to keep spirits alive? Was it the work of mischievous children, delighted at the thought of spooking soldiers and priests alike? Or did the bells truly sound without hands, a marvel that even today defies explanation? The lack of sources fuels debate, and the debate itself has become more enduring than the facts of food stores or battlement repairs. After all, no one tells bedtime stories about the exact weight of barley left in a granary, but everyone leans closer to hear about bells that ring themselves. On the walls, soldiers mark time by them. 2 bells since dawn, one mutters, so they'll attack by the 3rd. His comrade shakes his head. No 4 bells, then fire. It does not matter that the rhythms shift from night to night or that no 2 ears agree on the same number. What matters is that the bells give structure where none exists, slicing the endless waiting into intervals, however arbitrary. Without them, time itself would unravel, and waiting would become unbearable. In a perverse way, the phantom bells become the city's clock, striking not hours but endurance. Inside the homes, mothers hush children by promising that the bells are angels watching singing their way through stone walls. Fathers, less romantic, mutter that the bells are warnings not to waste wood or water. Old women tell both sides at once, weaving stories about saints with bronze tongues, or about long-dead priests testing whether the city is still faithful. Children predictably prefer the angel version, though one boy confesses he hopes the bells belong to a ghostly cook announcing supper. That joke retold for days becomes one of the few reliable smiles in the square. Quieter rituals develop. Some families place bowls of water under windows, convinced the ripples will show when bells pass by. Others hold their breath when they hear the tones, as if silence could help the sound linger. In one alley, neighbours light a single tallow lamp each night, not because they expect safety, but because they want the bells to find their way back. Faith-superstition experiment, it blurs into the same thing when uncertainty rules. Meanwhile, the besiegers outside grow uneasy. Word spreads that their men too hear bells in the night, though no church or cloister stands within reach. Some curse the defenders for trickery, claiming they must have hidden pipes or contraptions to broadcast sound. Others, less certain, mutter about demons. One soldier in a letter later preserved by accident wrote, "If the bells are theirs, we shall silence them. If they are not, may God silence us." His handwriting wavers as if he regretted the thought even while he wrote it. As weeks stretch, the paradox sharpens. The city grows thinner, its meals more meagre, its voices raspier, and yet the bells seem louder, at least in imagination. They mark not just hours, but moods, bold one night, hesitant another, soft as whispers, when hope falters, brazen as trumpets when a rumour of relief circulates. They become the heartbeat of Rhodes' phantom, or not defying logic while bodies grow weaker. The irony is sharp enough to taste silence devours, yet sound sustains. And here is the detail that lingers for modern ears whether or not the bells rang, the citizens believed in them. That belief itself became fact because it shaped choices, framed endurance, and gave meaning to suffering. History rarely records faith so vividly, but in this case it cannot avoid it. The bells, real, illusory, or invented, entered the marrow of the siege. Without them, the story would be ordinary, another tale of rations, walls, and weary soldiers. With them, it becomes haunting, half miracle and half madness. By the end of this phase, the defenders stand thinner shadows of their former selves, but they stand nonetheless. They lean on spears on each other, on stories of invisible bells. They endure because the alternative is collapse, and collapse is not yet an option. Whether the bells are God's gift, children's trick, or the city's collective dream they toll on in memory, the most stubborn sound of all. The siege grows longer, and as weeks bleed into months, the phantom bells begin to slip from rumour into something closer to collective experience. People who once scoffed at the very idea now confess, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with wide-eyed conviction, that they too have heard the metallic peal echo across the Stone Harbour walls. It always comes at twilight, just as the horizon burns with the last copper streaks of sun, and shadows pool like ink around the streets. The bells toll not like an orderly church service, but in strange sequences, sometimes slow, sometimes frantic, as if rung by a hand that does not belong to any priest still walking the earth. Children cling to their mothers' skirts when the sound rolls in, whispering that the bells are speaking in codes only the sea can understand. Old men make the sign of the cross and mutter that Rhodes itself is ringing its own funeral dirge centuries in advance. The mainstream historical fact is straightforward. Rhodes had long been a stronghold of religious and civic architecture. After the fall of Constantinople in 1204, the Knights Hospitaller transformed the city into a fortress glittering with churches, towers and gates. Bells were a regular feature used to signal time danger and sacred hours, but the phantom bells defy the pattern, because by the 14th century many chroniclers note that some towers stood silent, their real bells removed or melted down. Yet the ringing continued, reported again and again, as if the city itself refused silence. Inside taverns, sailors and merchants trade versions of the tale like currency. One swears he heard the bells from a ship 2 miles offshore rolling across the water like thunder that had lost its storm. Another insists the sound was clearest underground, echoing in the cisterns as if the earth itself remembered what the air should forget. A quirky tidbit comes from a Venetian traveller who recorded that the bells rang in answer to oaths. He claims he had just vowed to abandon gambling when a solemn toll rolled out, as if mocking his sudden piety. Whether his account is true or simply a gambler's dramatic flourish, it adds another layer to the mystery bells as divine comedians chiming at the expense of human vows. The guards along the battlements adopt their own interpretations. Some argue that the bells are a warning urging them to remain vigilant against raids. Others shrug that the sound is nothing more than the wind manipulating broken metal in abandoned towers. Historians still argue whether the phantom bells reflect natural acoustics, the wind funneling through collapsed stonework, or whether they were later embellishments designed to paint Rhodes as uniquely haunted. Whatever the truth, the effect on morale was unmistakable. Men and women grew attuned to listening for them, waiting for their arrival, almost like a ritual. The anticipation itself became part of the siege's rhythm, as steady as hunger and prayer. Even humour found a place in the growing legend. One fisherman joked that the bells must be announcing dinner, though the fish refused to listen. Another quipped that the bells were tolling for unpaid debts, warning merchants that the afterlife had an accounting office stricter than Venice. These brittle jokes carried weight because they gave people something to laugh about while staring into the hollow belly of siege and uncertainty. Jokes are currency during a famine, and Rhodes spent them sparingly. The bells even found their way into ritual. Priests led processions at twilight carrying icons through narrow streets, as the echoes rolled in. They claimed the sound was divine confirmation of their prayers, the voice of saints calling from heaven. Yet some whispered that the timing was too eerie, that perhaps spirits rather than saints held sway. It was not unusual in the medieval world for sacred and superstitious interpretations to blur into each other, but here in Rhodes, the blurring became the heartbeat of the mystery itself. Imagine a quiet evening, the harbour water lapping faintly, gulls screeching in their last flight home, families huddled around thin stews in cramped kitchens. Then, out of nowhere, a metallic peal vibrates through the city. Clay bowls rattle on shelves, dogs lift their heads, and the streets seem to pause mid-breath. A boy runs outside to see only to find the towers dark and the ropes untouched. He tells his friends and they smirk, saying he must have dreamed it. But when the sound echoes again, lower this time, they fall silent. The city is not dreaming, it is listening to something it cannot name. Centuries later, chroniclers admit they cannot explain the phenomenon. Some chalk it up to exaggeration, others to the psychological strain of long sieges. But the descriptions remain oddly consistent, bells tolling from towers, where no bells hung, heard not by one or two, but by dozens at once. The consistency is what gnaws at modern scholars, for hallucinations rarely synchronize across a whole community. That shared resonance makes the bells harder to dismiss, even if no physical evidence survives. In the end, the phantom bells of Rhodes become more than noise. They become a symbol. To the besieged, they are a reminder that the city still has a voice even when its people grow weary. To the besiegers, they are a riddle proof that Rhodes is not an ordinary fortress, but one with mysteries they cannot breach with catapults and rams. And to us listening across centuries, they are the sound of a city that refused to be silenced, even if only in echoes. The bells keep ringing, or so people insist, even as the years tick onward and the city of Rhodes shifts beneath their feet. At this point in the story, the sound has slipped from an unsettling curiosity into something much more divisive. Some residents treat it as a familiar companion, like the neighbour's rooster, who never knows when dawn actually starts, while others swear it signals impending misfortune. Each chime, faint and airy, seems to strike not only the air, but also the nerves of everyone within hearing range. Imagine standing in a bustling square with vendors hawking olives, figs and honey cakes, when suddenly a hush falls and heads tilt upward. No bells visible, no towers swinging, yet the unmistakable tone ripples through the air. People glance at each other with raised brows, some crossing themselves, some smirking, as if waiting for the sky to drop a practical joke. One mainstream historical fact makes this moment even stranger. Medieval Rhodes really did have bells imported by the Knights Hospitaller and later recast in Venetian foundries. Bells in this era were not just decorative noisemakers, but deeply woven into civic life, used to mark time, summon markets, or signal danger. Normally their sound came with predictable rhythm, but here in the tale the phantom chimes are irregular, surfacing at dusk. One week at noon, the next, sometimes in the dead of night when even owls seem too tired to stir. That unpredictability makes them impossible to dismiss as memory or echo. Instead, the sound builds reputation, accumulating the weight of legend every time another pair of ears swears I heard it too. Quirky details begin to circulate. One fisherman insists he heard the bells not from the harbour, but from beneath the sea, tolling faintly through the water, like some submerged cathedral calling fish to prayer. Children add to the game, claiming the bells change tone depending on whether one listens with eyes closed or open. A boy swears that if you cup your ears with saffron-dyed cloth, the bells shift pitch, though his sister says he only invented that excuse to steal her scarf. Laughter mingles with unease because even children recognise that jokes are softer ways of speaking about fear. The clergy cannot ignore it. Priests gather in cloisters lit by oil lamps and debate whether the bells are a divine sign or a mischievous illusion sent to test faith. Some argue that if the bells call people to prayer, they must be obeyed regardless of their origin. Others counter that following an unseen voice risks idolatry as though bowing before shadows. One story claims that a group of monks once processed toward the phantom sound, with candles held high, chanting hymns that quavered with both hope and nerves, only for the bells to vanish the moment they stepped outside the gates. Historians still argue whether this tale was pious embroidery or a genuine attempt to capture the unease of that night. Either way, the silence that followed was heavier than the ringing itself, a void more haunting than the noise had ever been. Merchants, being practical people, view the matter through the lens of commerce. Some capitalise on the mystery crafting charms shaped like tiny bronze bells to sell as protective tokens. Pilgrims passing through Rhodes snap them up, convinced the trinkets will ward off demons, bad weather or late payments. Others grumble that the phantom bells drive customers away since no one wants to shop under a sky that seems to mock human business with spectral tolls. A tavern keeper quips that if the bells keep stealing his customers' attention, he'll hang his own kettle on the wall and clang it every time a phantom peal sounds. At least then people will return to their cups with a smile. Sailors add their voices as sailors always do. Some claim to have heard the bells ringing out over the sea even when they are a league from shore. For them the sound becomes tangled with omens of storms guiding stars and unlucky voyages. A tale grows of a ship that ignored the bells and vanished into a gale, while another that paused to pray at the phantom ringing returned safely. These contradictory outcomes only fuel debate because when mystery touches the sea, it multiplies into 1,000 stories as quickly as waves on water. The phantom bells also wedge themselves into politics. City councils mutter about whether they should commission investigations lest the phenomenon weaken Rhodes's reputation among allies. A few officials argue that reporting such strange occurrences might invite ridicule from rivals in Constantinople or Venice. Better, they suggest, to stay silent and let the sound become just another quirk of island life. Yet others press for action, pointing out that every unexplained toll feeds unease, and unease breeds unrest. Silence, they say, is no solution when the whole city leans forward to listen. The arguments swirl, but no consensus arrives. mirroring the bells themselves, loud enough to be noticed, elusive enough to escape grasp. Meanwhile, the common people adapt. Housewives stir stews over low fires, and remark casually whether the bells will ring before supper. Shepherds on the hills whistle along mockingly when they hear the tones making their flocks jump at the sudden sound. Children devise games of prediction betting fig seeds on when the next toll will arrive, cheering or groaning depending on whose guess proves closest. Humour stitches daily life back together, though the stitches are loose, unravelling every time another phantom chime echoes. The atmosphere of Rhodes shifts accordingly. Nights grow heavier, conversations shorter, and even festivals cannot entirely smother the question, what tolls when no bell swings, the city carries on markets, open, ships sail, prayers rise, but under the surface everyone is listening. The bells, whether real, imagined, or conjured by some deeper force, have become a new rhythm for the island, a drumbeat that no drummer beats. And so the story edges deeper into its own mystery. The bells are no longer a curiosity but a character in the life of the city, commanding attention, stirring debate and dividing the islanders between those who laugh and those who cross themselves. Historians still argue whether the accounts represent genuine auditory phenomena, psychological mass suggestion, or deliberate invention by chroniclers eager to spice dull records with drama. But the people of Rhodes, living day by day, do not need scholarly debate to tell them what there is here. To them the bells are real enough, real as hunger, real as fear, real as hope. The bells of Rhodes, those invisible voices strung somewhere between history and legend, grow louder in the imagination as the years press forward. By the 14th century, Rhodes is no longer a sleepy outpost, but a fortified island ruled by the Knights Hospitaller. Its harbour gleams with masts, its streets echo with a jumble of Greek, Latin, Arabic and Italian, and its walls stretch so high that even modern visitors would tilt their heads and mutter something like, "Yep, that's going to be hard to climb." Yet in the middle of this stone-clad confidence whispers persist, bells ring at odd hours, and nobody seems to know who is pulling the ropes. Sailors are often the first to notice. Coming into the port late at night, sails slack in a faint breeze, they pause and swear. They hear a peal drifting across the water. Some describe it as clear and bright, like silver notes leaping from a tower. Others say it is low and hollow, as if the island itself is groaning through bronze lungs. Either way, it carries enough conviction that captains cross themselves and order their crews to keep a sharper lookout. Mariners, after all, have a knack for superstition. They are the sort who nail old shoes to masts to ward off storms. A bell with no tower fits neatly into their cargo of omens. One mainstream historical fact steadies the account the Knights Hospitaller really did outfit Rhodes with formidable defences, constructing bastions and towers admired even by enemies. The city bristled with chapels and churches, each with bells for calling worshippers. So in theory the sound of ringing bells was not unusual, but here lies the twist. Chronicles from the time make specific mention of bells heard when no services were held or in places where no bell tower stood. The bells of stone chapels do not explain a sound drifting from the sea on calm nights when nothing should have carried. Inside the walled city, citizens turn the mystery into dinner table talk. Children tease one another, daring their siblings to climb the battlements at night and find the bell ghost. Street vendors work the story into their sales pitches. Buy my figs, and you'll hear the bells chime sweeter. There is even a quirky tidbit preserved in one travel account, that an enterprising innkeeper offered rooms with a view of the phantom bells, which of course meant nothing at all but sold better to wide-eyed pilgrims. History is full of snake oil salesmen. This one simply tapped into acoustics and rumour. Theologians naturally join the debate. Some argue that the bells are a heavenly sign, proof that Rhodes is under divine protection. One friar preaches that St. Michael himself rings them to warn of attacks, which is a comforting idea, until you ask why the bells ring when there is no attack. Others counter that the bells are demonic mockery shadows of sound meant to unsettle the faithful. Historians still argue whether these sermons were recorded as genuine belief or as colourful flourishes in chronicles meant to spice up otherwise dry entries of taxation and land disputes. Either way, the bells become part of the city's shared identity, half superstition, half entertainment. The knights themselves are not immune. Imagine armoured men with scarred faces used to real battle sitting around a fire and muttering about how they heard the bell again. One commander supposedly ordered a full sweep of the walls, convinced that some prankster was tolling an actual bell to spread unease. The search turned up nothing. Another knight is rumoured to have kept a bronze handbell in his chamber, insisting he would compare the sound if it ever came again, as though mystery could be solved with a side-by-side performance. Spoiler, it wasn't. Beyond the humour, the bells acquire teeth. Rhodes, sitting at the edge of Christian and Muslim worlds, is constantly aware of siege and war. Each unexplained chime, especially at night, stirs fears that a fleet might be approaching, or a spy is signalling from within. A single clang in the dark can send watchmen scurrying to their posts, spears clattering, hearts pounding. It is the sort of psychological warfare that no general actually planned, but which works better than any catapult. Fear, after all, is economical. Meanwhile, scholars centuries later attempt to retrofit explanations. One theory proposes that wind caught in the arches of ruined towers created harmonic echoes, essentially nature playing its own instruments. Another suggests that the harbour's unique acoustics bouncing waves against stone produced metallic reverberations mistaken for bells. A more modern cheeky idea is that the clanging came from ships themselves, their rigging and iron fittings groaning in the night. Each explanation is tidy, but each struggles to account for the same thing: why people across generations insisted they heard organised ringing, not random noise. Locals, of course, prefer their own interpretations. Some say the bells belong to a church swallowed by the sea, its spire just beneath the waves. Fishermen repeat the story with enough conviction that one almost imagines nets snagging on a sunken steeple. Others whisper that the bells toll for those who will not survive the year a medieval version of Final Destination, except more poetic and less Hollywood. It is chilling, certainly, but also irresistible. People lean closer when a story brushes against mortality. Even today, tourists who stroll the old town at night sometimes report a strange ringing. Guides smile politely and let the mystery hang, knowing it sells, as well as postcards. The phantom bells, whether supernatural or not, outlast their own context. They are one of those historical quirks where the absence of an answer is the point. And so, in this stretch of Rhodes' medieval history, the bells toll not for victory or loss, but for uncertainty. They become a reminder that even in an age obsessed with stone and certainty, sound could still slip through elusive, untethered. A fortress may stand for centuries, but a rumour, especially one shaped like music, drifts farther and lingers longer. Somewhere between prayer and prank, the bells keep ringing. The bells of Rhodes, or rather the absence of them, become a kind of mirror for the people who live beneath their silence. As the siege grinds on, as the Ottoman camp tightens its noose around the island, the story of phantom bells rises in every conversation, like steam from a pot that has been left too long on the fire. They speak of bells that toll at dawn, though no clapper moves, of bells that echo at midnight, though no tower shakes. And these stories, repeated in whispers, do not merely describe events, they shape them. People act differently because of the bells, as though unseen chimes orchestrate their lives. The baker who once opened his shop at sunrise now insists he hears the bells an hour earlier, so he bakes sooner, producing loaves that go stale before the customers arrive. A mother hushes her child more quickly at night because she claims the bells sound like warnings tolling for silence. A soldier sharpens his sword in rhythm with tones no one else can hear. This is where the tale slips firmly into the space between faith and hallucination. Mainstream history reminds us that the island of Rhodes endured multiple sieges, with the most famous being the Ottoman assault of 1522, a campaign so devastating it reshaped the Mediterranean balance of power. Chroniclers of that siege noted the exhaustion, the hunger, the ceaseless noise of cannon fire echoing off stone walls. Under such conditions, the human mind often manufactures patterns and sounds, phantom echoes that fill the void between sleep and wakefulness. Historians still argue whether the bells of Rhodes were such hallucinations a product of collective stress, or whether some other phenomenon, natural or supernatural, lay behind them. For those who endured the long months of fear, however, the distinction hardly mattered. To them the bells were real, and reality is often less about what is proven, and more about what is lived. The bells became a currency of conversation, traded in markets and whispered in cloisters. Pilgrims who had once come to Rhodes for relics now lingered to hear the bells that no one could find. Some claimed the sound came from beneath the earth, as though buried cathedrals were singing, to remind the living of their forgotten foundations. Others suggested the sea itself was tolling waves, striking hidden caverns with uncanny precision. One fisherman insisted the bells rang loudest when storms gathered, as if Neptune himself were hammering an iron gong beneath the waves. A quirky tidbit survives in a later account. A knight of the Order of St. John supposedly built a contraption of strings and shells, stretching it across the battlements, convinced he could record the vibrations of the phantom bells. His contraption broke in the first strong wind, scattering shells across the courtyard, and his companions teased him mercilessly, calling him the Shell Knight ever after. Yet even in the laughter, there was unease. The failed attempt to trap the sound only deepened its mystery as though the bells themselves refused capture. What unsettled the besiegers most was that they too began to speak of hearing the bells. Ottoman soldiers hardened by war, and far from home muttered that strange sounds echoed from the Christian city sounds that seemed to mark their steps or mock their silence. Some claimed the bells rang louder on nights when their morale was lowest, as if the city were mocking them. Others swore the bells sounded like prayers words in a tongue they did not know, but felt deep in their bones. The commanders dismissed these rumours, reminding their men that discipline, not superstition, wins wars. But even the sternest officer could not silence the whispers that spread through the tents like smoke. The duality is fascinating inside the walls. The bells became a sign of hope, proof that the city was not alone, that unseen allies might still be watching. Outside, the same bells became an omen of dread, a sound without source hinting that the siege might stretch into infinity. One scholar later compared the bells to Schrödinger's cat, though without the cat, and centuries before Schrödinger. The bells were both there and not their proof, and illusion, promise, and threat, existing only because everyone agreed to argue about them. Daily life began to conform to the rhythm of these phantom tolls. Mothers timed meals by them, soldiers changed watch by them, priests altered prayers by them, and still no one could agree where they came from. One suggestion passed down in a curious chronicle proposed that underground cisterns amplified footsteps or dropped stones into booming echoes that resembled bells. Another theory blamed the sea wind funneling through towers and arches, creating tones much like an organ pipe. Historians still argue whether either explanation holds water, for no consistent physical cause has ever been demonstrated. The bells also infiltrated art. A poet of Rhodes, writing in the margins of a psalter, described the bells as silver throats speaking through stone, a line that survives though his name does not. A mason carved crude bell shapes onto the side of a cistern, as though to mock the unseen sound. Later travellers even reported villagers painting bells on shutters and doors, little charms meant to appease whatever spirit caused the noises. Humour remained too. One tavern keeper joked that if the bells were real, they should at least drink his wine before ringing all night. His patrons laughed, but not for long. The echo of a phantom toll interrupted their mirth, leaving mugs trembling in their hands. By this point, the phantom bells were no longer just a mystery. They were a presence. They governed the mood of the city as surely as rations or cannon fire. When they told hope or fear, spiked. When they fell silent, the void itself was worse, a silence so thick it seemed to suffocate thought. And perhaps that is why the story endures, not because bells rang, but because people needed them to. In hunger and despair, the human imagination tolls its own music, finding rhythm even in ruin, and so the bells stand at their loudest and their most mysterious. The city waits poised between collapse and survival, between silence and sound. Beyond the walls, the besiegers murmur in unease. Within them, defenders cling to every echo as if it were proof that they are not yet forgotten. And still no one knows whether the bells are bronze wind or something stranger. The bells no longer ring, but the echo of their mystery carries through the centuries like a wave that refuses to break. Rhodes, with its sun-bleached stones and whispering winds, still holds the shape of those unanswered questions, and anyone strolling its medieval lanes at dusk can almost imagine the chime that once startled soldiers, monks and fishermen alike. The island moves forward, markets open, ferries come and go, tourists snap pictures of ruins, but the memory of sound that may never have existed continues to pulse beneath it all. It is here in the gap between what is known and what is guessed that the phantom bells of Rhodes find their true power. Mainstream historical fact tells us that Rhodes was a crossroads of commerce and conflict, a place where ships from Venice, Byzantium and Cairo unloaded goods and gossip alike. It was also a fortress of immense strategic weight, particularly after the Knights Hospitaller transformed it into their bastion in the early 15th century. They invested heavily in walls, towers and harbours, determined to keep the Ottoman tide at bay. A city of stone and sea, therefore, was always a city of vigilance, its population attuned to every clang of armour and every creak of timber. Against that backdrop, the sudden and unexplained tolling of bells acquires even sharper edges. It is not simply folklore, it is the intrusion of the inexplicable into a culture obsessed with preparation. Quirky tidbits still cling to the story, each adding a new wrinkle. One friar's chronicle insists the bells rang only when the island was about to face not soldiers, but storms. According to him, the heavens used bronze tongues to announce incoming gales. Another sailor, less holy but no less dramatic, swore the bells sounded during drunken nights when no churchmen were awake to verify them, suggesting that perhaps wine and imagination were partners in crime. And of course, there is the enduring local joke that perhaps the bells were just overly enthusiastic goats, their collars mistaken for a chorus. Joking aside, humour always tags along with fear, because laughter trims the edges of uncertainty. Yet historians still argue whether the phantom bells were ever more than metaphor. Were they invented later, embroidered into chronicles to lend drama to otherwise routine sieges? Did the legend originate as a way for the Hospitallers to claim divine favour, proof that heaven itself provided an alarm system? Or were they genuinely heard phenomena of acoustics, perhaps the sound of waves striking hidden caverns, magnified into tones that mimicked bronze? The debates remain lively, even if they are unresolvable, and perhaps it is the irresolution itself that ensures the bells continue to ring in memory. The centuries offer no closure. Renaissance travellers sketch the ruins of towers and scribble puzzled notes about bells that no man did strike. Enlightenment scholars scoff, chalking it up to medieval superstition, while romantic poets seize the tale, eagerly weaving verses about bronze voices in the mist. Modern archaeologists wander the island, noting the absence of any great hidden belfry, but even they admit that geology sometimes surprises caves can sing. Winds can hum, stones can resonate in tones uncanny enough to fool tired ears. The phantom bells thus remain perched between categories, half science, half legend, entirely captivating. In the evenings when the tourist crowds thin and the light turns honey soft, locals sometimes tell the story again. A fisherman sipping ouzo might lean toward his companions and say, "My grandfather swore he heard them once." A grandmother brushing crumbs from her apron might add that as a child she too thought she heard a toll floating through the air when no church stood nearby. Are these just echoes of echoes, stories inherited and reshaped? Likely so. But as with all good mysteries, likelihood matters less than effect. The tale continues to tint the streets of Rhodes with an invisible shimmer, inviting every new visitor to lean in and listen harder. And here is where the narrative begins to soften, drifting toward that hush you've been waiting for all along. The city quiets, the sea sighs against the harbour walls, and the phantom bells fade into a lull of possibility. Their exact nature may never be explained, but that is precisely why they endure. A riddle without an answer does not diminish, it grows, drawing power from the silence around it. And so the bells toll on, not in bronze but in imagination, chiming softly enough to carry you toward rest. Now the wind down begins easing each detail into calm, as if the story itself were a hand smoothing creases from a blanket. Imagine the twilight over Rhodes, violet and gold streaks dissolving into night, the air cooling, and the harbour's lamps flickering awake one by one. The voices of the day grow faint, the footsteps on cobbles slow, and the ancient stones seem to breathe with you. The temple ruins and fortress walls recline into shadow, their histories heavy but their presence serene. All that lingers is the suggestion of sound, distant, gentle, almost like bells but softer, more like the rhythm of your own breath. Let unanswered questions drift like clouds. They do not demand your effort now, they simply hover companions in stillness. The phantom bells of Rhodes remain locked in history, but for you they become part of this night's cradle, ringing only in the hush of imagination. Let each toll be a step downward into rest, each pause between notes a deeper quiet. The city of stone and sea recedes, the waves stretch out, and you are carried with them steady and unhurried. Breathe slower now, shoulders ease. The bells do not summon you to battle, they invite you to slumber. The mystery rests, the city rests, and soon so will you. Sweet dreams.